Luke woke before the sun, because that was what he had learned to do after so many seasons of the same routine. Feed the horses, check the fences, walk the rows where the grass had been chewed thin by winter's hunger. Listen to the land and the small sounds that meant weather or trouble. The ranch had a memory the way an old friend does. Every gate hinge and post had a story. Every lowing and snort carried an echo of someone who had once been there to answer it. He moved through the morning like a man who had learned to inhabit silence without being crushed by it. There was a rhythm to his loneliness, a steadiness that kept the days measured. He liked the way dawn broke over the east fields, spreading pale gold across the hollows and the backs of the horses. It felt honest, uncomplicated, even the ache for the life he used to have. A different house, a different laugh, fit into the pattern, manageable in small doses. He could breathe with it. He could live with it. That had been enough for a long time. The sky began to change while he was mending a fence line by the lower pasture. Clouds gathered, the kind that moved in with purpose, not the lazy, scattershot clouds that decided to hover for a week. The wind shifted and carried the scent of rain. Not just rain, but the heavy mineral smell that warned of a downpour. He glanced up, hefted his tools into the truck, and turned toward the farmhouse, enjoying the way the farm looked translated by the cool incoming light, sharper, more defined. The ranch felt like a living thing in that weather, gearing itself up for what it needed to do. By the time he reached the porch, the first strong drops were smacking the tin roof. He pulled the screen door closed behind him and watched the storm come across the fields. Lightning knifed slow through the clouds, and a distant rumble rolled the hills. He made coffee and stood by the kitchen window, watching the world go gray, feeling the familiar tightening in his shoulders that came with storms. That's when he saw the pickup. It was an old thing, once red, now a washed-out rust color, the kind of truck that had been kept because it still ran, and because someone somewhere had refused to let go. It pulled up the drive with the slow, uncertain lurch of a vehicle that had been coaxed to life many times. Headlights cut through the rain, scattering diamonds across the wet field. The truck stopped at the gate, the engine coughing once before settling. A woman climbed down from the cab, and a girl slipped out from the passenger side. Both were drenched, hair plastered to their faces and clothes clinging with rain. Luke was on the porch before he thought about it, boots slapping wood. Instinct had always been quicker than thought. The woman looked as if the wind had lived in her for a while. Rain streaked her cheekbones, and her mouth was set with the kind of tired decision that says you don't have the luxury of falling apart. The girl, maybe 12, maybe 14, held a small backpack to her chest like it was a shield. She had a softness to her, a look that made Luke's throat tighten because he recognized a kind of quiet, the way you recognize the taste of a childhood meal. "Rough night to be on the road," he said, voice low, not a question so much as an offering. Rain stitched the space between them. The woman wiped her face with the back of her hand and smiled, though the smile did not reach her eyes. "Our truck finally gave up on us," she said. Her voice had a place-worn cadence, the sound of someone who was used to making small arrangements for survival. I thought maybe you could point us to the nearest town?" "Closest mechanic's over in Dalton, 20 miles. He glanced at the license plate, at the mud-splattered map of a life they carried on their clothes. "You can wait it out here. Guest house has got a wood stove. Come on out of that." There was a brief weighing in her face, a calculation of independence versus the relief of shelter. Then she let out a breath that sounded like acceptance. "Thank you," she said, and stepped forward. The girl hesitated, then followed. She moved with the same careful scrutiny of someone learning the way of living around strangers, and when she reached the porch, she paused and met Luke's eyes. There was a small, almost shy nod of gratitude. "Thank you," she echoed, voice hardly above the rain. Inside, the guest house was small and stubbornly lived in, the kind of place that carried the smell of old quilts and good coffee. Luke made a fire while the woman, Clara, he learned when she told him, as though names warranted saying in the open air, hung the girl's wet jacket on the line. The girl, Elsie, watched the flames like a creature watching for the return of a lost son. She sat on the worn couch as if the cushions were a world she had to remeasure for safety. They did not speak much at first. There was a dance of necessity. Clara gave Luke the brief version of their story. The truck, the long trip away from a place that had been too small for the kind of hurt she was trying to leave behind. She spoke with an economy of detail that felt like a hand keeping a wound covered. Luke didn't press. He'd learned a long time ago that people would reveal what they were ready to reveal, and that patience was less about waiting and more about making a place where someone would choose to unfold themselves. They ate soup boiled on the stove, the steam fogging the windows until the world outside became a smear of gray. Elsie ate slowly, eyes moving between the window and the warmth of the bowl. She had a way of blooming small smiles into her face when she thought no one was looking. There was a steadiness to it that made Luke's chest ache in a way he wasn't used to naming. He found himself telling a quiet story about a stubborn calf he'd once raised, a small, foolish human moment that earned a ripple of laughter from Clara and a delighted, surprised laugh from Elsie that sounded like rain on a tin roof. Outside, the storm softened, the first sharp edges of wind settling into a steady rain. Luke walked them to the shed where they could stash their gear and offered a toolbox to the woman whose face had grown slack with worry. "We'll have a look at it in the morning," he said. "No sense trying to fix an axle until daylight." She shook her head, shoulders relaxing. "We're not staying long. Just until we can get the truck right." He believed her, because most people meant what they said until life proved otherwise. But when he turned back toward the porch and caught Elsie watching him from the doorway, he paused. The girl's gaze was honest, unguarded in the way kids can be when they're measuring a person's heart instead of their face. "Thanks," she said, voice small and bright like the first note of a song. She said the word plainly, as if gratitude were a coin in a pocket to be given away. Luke felt something loosen inside him. He had helped plenty of people. He had kept many souls from the worst of the weather. He had not expected the warmth that rose in his chest at that simple, genuine sound. The ranch had made room for the moment, as if it had been waiting. When the rain slowed to a soft mist, he lit another lamp on the porch and watched them move about the guest house, their silhouettes gentle and human against the frosted glass. He thought of his former life, of the laughter that had once folded through these rooms like sunlight. The memory hummed but did not sting. For the first time in years, the house felt like it might hold more than he'd thought it could. He felt the strange, unfamiliar tug of possibility, a small, tentative thing, no bigger than the breath he drew. He stood there until the light outside wore thin, until the rain had eased to the hush of last drops. Elsie sat by the window, forehead against the cool glass, watching the field where the horses grazed, and Clara folded laundry in a quiet rhythm that looked like prayer. Luke turned off the lamp and stepped into the night, letting the porch light wink out behind him because he wanted to drink the silence honestly, unfiltered. The ranch had been a chapel of solitude for so long that the thought of company felt risky. But as he crossed the yard in the damp air and listened to the lowing of cattle, the creak of an old gate in the wind, he realized something that surprised him with its simplicity. Kindness was not a flood, but a door. He had opened it tonight for two strangers. He watched them through the screen, two small figures moving in the light, and felt the first, fragile shift of his world. It was only rain and coffee and a borrowed bed. It was also the beginning of something that, like an old fence mended in the right way, would hold. He did not know what shape it would take, only that when he turned back to the house, the porch no longer looked as empty as it had that morning. Morning broke slow and golden across the ranch, the kind of light that spread warmth through the windows before the day had even decided what it would be. Luke woke to the sound of roosters and the low hum of the wind slipping through the fields. He brewed coffee, the smell of it curling into the air like a familiar ghost, and watched the horizon blush orange. For years that view had been the only company he needed. But today there was the faint echo of movement beyond the barn, laughter, hesitant and small. It startled him in the gentlest way. Clara and Elsie were already awake. From the porch he saw Clara sweeping the porch steps of the guest house, her hair tied back loosely, the morning sun catching strands of it. Elsie crouched near the fence, trying to coax a barn cat closer with a piece of leftover bread. It was such an ordinary picture that Luke stood for a moment longer than necessary, unsure why it felt like a memory he hadn't lived yet. He carried 2 mugs across the yard. Clara looked up as he approached, smiling politely, that same guarded smile that never gave too much away. "You didn't have to," she said, taking the cup. "Wasn't sure if you'd found the coffee yet," he answered. "It's better than the instant stuff in there." She sipped and nodded. "You're right about that." The silence between them wasn't awkward. It had a kind of shape to it, like a well-built fence that defined space without closing it off. He could feel her watching the land. The rolling pasture, the oak trees in the distance, the faint outline of horses moving slow through the grass. "It's beautiful here," she said quietly. "Peaceful." "It can be," he replied. "Sometimes it's just quiet. The difference depends on the day." She smiled again, this time faintly real. Elsie ran up to them, cheeks flushed. "They can't let me pet her," she said proudly. "She's soft." Luke crouched a little to meet her eyes. "That one's named Daisy. She pretends to be wild, but she just likes people who don't rush her." Elsie grinned, nodding like she'd been told a secret worth keeping. For a second, Luke saw something pure. A spark of childhood that hadn't yet been taken by whatever shadows her family carried. The hours passed in small chores and easy rhythms. Luke showed Clara where the hens nested and how to gather eggs. She moved with practiced care, hands sure, as if she'd worked hard most of her life. He noticed she didn't complain, not even when the sun got hot. Elsie followed along, her laughter bright enough to make the animals lift their heads. By noon, Clara had made sandwiches in the kitchen. Luke joined them at the table, hat on his knee. The meal was simple, but it felt like more than food. It felt like company. "Do you live out here alone?" she asked after a while. He nodded. "Used to have help. A few hands come by now and then during harvest, but mostly it's me." "That must get lonely," he shrugged. "You get used to your own company. Some days I even like it." Clara looked down at her plate, then out the window. "I used to say the same thing." He waited, but she didn't continue. He didn't press. People spoke in their own time. When the sun dipped lower, Luke saddled a horse and offered to show Elsie how to ride. Her eyes lit up in disbelief, then joy. "Really? Really? She's gentle. Name's Penny." Clara hesitated, but nodded. "Go on, sweetheart. Be careful." Luke walked beside the horse, steadying the reins, teaching her how to sit, how to let the rhythm of the animal guide her. Elsie giggled every time the horse moved faster. Her laughter cut through the evening air like music he didn't realize he missed. Clara stood nearby, arms folded but smiling with a quiet tenderness that softened her entire face. As the sun fell behind the hills, painting the world in amber light, Luke handed the reins back. "You did good," he said. "I was scared at first," Elsie admitted. "But then, it felt like flying." "That's the secret," he said. "Most things worth doing feel a little scary at first." That night, after supper, they sat on the porch of the guest house. The air smelled of grass and wood smoke. Crickets began their nightly song, and somewhere far off, an owl called. Clara leaned back, staring at the horizon. Luke sat on the steps, his hands folded around his cup. "Do you ever get storms this time of year?" she asked. "Now and then," he said. "They roll in fast. But they pass fast, too. Like most things, I guess." He looked up at her. There was something about the way she said it. Not careless, not sad, just true. He wondered what kind of storms she had already weathered. Elsie had fallen asleep inside, her small form visible through the screen door. The lamplight made the room glow soft and golden. Clara followed his gaze and smiled faintly. "She's tougher than she looks," she said. "She seems brave. She had to be. I made sure of that." Her tone carried something heavy beneath it, the kind of weight that didn't need explanation. Luke wanted to ask where they came from, what they were running from, but he knew better. People like her didn't volunteer their stories until trust made space for it. Instead, he said, "You both did good work today. You can stay as long as you need to." She turned to him, startled by the offer. "That's kind of you, but I don't want to be a burden." "You're not," he said. "There's always more work than hands around here. It's fair trade." She nodded slowly, then looked back toward the fields, her expression unreadable. The wind moved her hair across her face, and she brushed it away absently. "Thank you," she said, and it was quiet but sincere. Later that night, Luke lay in bed listening to the rain begin again. It wasn't a hard storm, just a soft patter across the roof. He thought about the way Clara had looked at the sky earlier, the mixture of longing and fear in her eyes. He thought about the way Elsie had laughed. For the first time in years, he didn't fall asleep counting the things he'd lost. He fell asleep thinking about what was here. The following morning brought clear skies and crisp air. Clara was already hanging laundry when Luke stepped out. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. "I like mornings," she said. "They feel like a clean page." He nodded, understanding. They spent the day fixing the old truck. Luke worked on the engine while Clara handed him tools. Elsie sat nearby drawing shapes in the dirt with a stick, humming to herself. Every so often she asked questions about the horses, about the sky, about whether the ranch had always been his. He answered with the patience of someone who had forgotten how to talk so easily but found it coming back to him. When the truck finally sputtered to life, Clara laughed. A genuine sound, light and disbelieving. "I can't remember the last time something went right on the first try," she said. "Guess you brought luck," he replied. She shook her head. "Luck's not something I've ever been good at." Then she stopped, realizing how that sounded, and added softly, "But maybe it's changing." That evening they shared supper again. Elsie chattered about horses and storms, her voice bright against the steady rhythm of the crickets. Luke watched the way Clara listened to her daughter. Every word, every gesture, with a tenderness that came from years of protecting something fragile. There was history in that love and a trace of fear, as if she still believed happiness was something that could be taken. After Elsie went to bed, Clara lingered on the porch. She looked up at the stars, arms folded against the chill. "When I was little," she said quietly, "my father used to tell me that every star was a story God hadn't finished yet. I used to think mine was one of the dim ones," she smiled sadly. "I guess I stopped looking for it for a while." Luke studied her face, the faint lines near her eyes, the shadows that time and worry had carved there. "Stories change," he said. "Sometimes they just take longer to finish." She turned to him, meeting his gaze for the first time fully, without her usual guarded distance. Something passed between them. Not romance yet, but recognition, the quiet acknowledgement of two people who understood the weight of loss. The wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of rain again. She looked toward the dark horizon. "I should get some rest," she said softly. "Tomorrow's another long day. Good night, Clara. Good night, Luke." When she disappeared inside, he stayed where he was. The stars stretched wide and endless above him, and for a moment, the silence didn't feel like emptiness anymore. It felt like possibility, raw and waiting. Somewhere in that stillness, he realized the ranch had started to sound different. It had voices again, soft, uncertain, human. And within that fragile sound, he felt the first real stirrings of something he hadn't dared to name in years. He turned toward the light of the guest house one last time before walking back to his own door. Through the curtain, he saw Clara checking on Elsie, pulling the blanket up to her shoulders, touching her hair with a tenderness that glowed brighter than the lamp. He thought of the word home, how it used to mean a place. Tonight it felt more like a heartbeat. The wind sighed through the fields as he closed the door behind him. The house creaked, the night breathed, and Luke found himself smiling in the dark. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he was certain of one thing. The quiet had changed, and so had he. She woke him with a sound that was closer to a small animal's frightened breath than a child's cry. Luke had been roused from a sleep that didn't keep him long. Faint dreams folded into the ordinary by the thin noise that threaded its way down the hall. He swung his legs out of bed without thinking, feet finding the floor in the old rhythm of a man who had spent half his life waking before the sun. The house was a dark shell around him. the lamp glow from the guest room leaking just enough to make shadows friendly. He found Elsie in the hallway, wrapped in a thin blanket like a ship in a storm. She sat on the stairs with her knees pulled up, face buried in her arms. The sound she made when she tried to speak was small and hollow. Luke crouched down beside her, letting his presence be steady and ordinary, the way a packed earth fence holds back a field. He did not ask what was wrong. He did not demand an answer. He simply folded his hands around his knees and waited. When her head lifted, her eyes were glassy, the pupils blown wide by a night that had stretched thin. "He comes," she whispered. The words were little stones tossed onto water, making rings of panic. "My father sneaks in every night." For a beat, Luke's mind stalled, running through shapes. The man he'd seen at the barn? The man who had been mentioned in passing? He felt the old, familiar, slow caution settle in him. He had learned over years of solitude how to take stories apart before deciding which pieces were sharp and which could be trusted. "Slow breath, Elsie," he said, voice low and careful, shape to be unthreatening. "Tell me what you mean." She folded her small hands into his as if clinging to someone for balance. "He comes to the window and he says he's sorry. He stands on the porch when the light is off. He waits until I think he's gone, and then he sneaks in through." She stopped, fingers tightening on the blanket. Her voice dropped to a breath. "He tries to touch my hair. He says he's proud of me, and then he leaves before Mama wakes." Luke's first reaction was anger. Quick, hot, the kind that comes uninvited and is impossible to fully trust. He had seen enough of human failure to understand the complicated shapes a man could fall into, and anger was never the first language he chose. He swallowed it, feeling it pass like bile and settle into something else, a fierce protectiveness that didn't need words to announce itself. "You're here," he said simply. "You're safe. I'm not going to let anyone hurt you." His tone was a promise without flourish. He stood slowly, careful not to make the boy in the hall feel smaller. "Come on, I'll sit with you until you fall back asleep." They went to the living room and settled into the worn couch. The lamp painted the room in soft lamplight, and outside the world lay dark and quiet. Elsie's breathing slowed in his company. Luke let the silence do its work, letting the thread of fear be rewoven into something manageable, something with edges he could see. Morning pushed into the day like a cautious animal, bringing with it the ordinary light. Clara was already at the kitchen table when he went in, hands wrapped around a mug as if it kept her from floating away. Her face looked like the weather, clear, with a streak of gray worry. Luke set his own cup down and watched her measure each breath. "Something's wrong," he said matter-of-factly. No preamble, no beating around the bramble. She flinched, not in surprise, but in the way of someone pulled an old bruise. Her fingers tightened on the mug. For a moment, she did not speak. The house held its breath with them. "He's been—" She stopped, each word chosen with care. "He's been around, Luke. Not always. Just once or twice. I thought I could keep it from her. Thought I could deal with it." In the slow, painful honesty of it, she looked smaller, softer than she had in the porch light. "I didn't want to scare her. I wanted to protect her from him." "You should have told me," Luke said. The words were not accusation. They were the map of a plan forming. "I wanted to," she admitted. "I wanted to tell someone. But I have a way of making things sound worse than they are when I say them out loud, and I kept thinking I could handle it myself." Her voice edged toward brittle humor and broke. "I couldn't." He moved to the window and looked out at the pasture where the horses were grazing like slow, contented thoughts. He could imagine the porch, the dark of night, the thin outline of a man with guilt stitched into his shoulders. He could imagine, too, the way the mind twists memories into monsters when a child is asleep and alone. "Did he ever hurt her?" he asked carefully. "No," Clara said, though the tremor in her jaw betrayed the lie she almost told herself. "He never did anything like that. But he showed up. He confessed. He thought it would help." She swallowed. It scared her. That was enough. If the man had not crossed the line, if there had only been stalker-ish appearances and apologies that left wounds, then the law of the land would take care of it. If there had been more, then there were different steps to take. Luke's mind began to shape itself around what needed doing. First and foremost, the child needed to know they were safe. "We'll make a plan," he said. There was the practicality of the ranch in his voice, the worker's instinct to put a problem on a table and name the tools. "We'll lock the windows. We'll set lights on timers. I'll sit out on the porch some nights if that helps. You'll call the number for legal aid and the police when you're ready. We'll do whatever you need." She nodded, relief and shame and exhaustion warring in her eyes. "I don't know if he'd listen to the police. He's lost a lot of things, Luke. He's lost himself. But maybe hearing it from someone else will make it stick." Her hands twisted. "I'm so tired of running." They worked through the day like men and women setting a fence line, measured, methodical, steady. Luke spent the morning checking locks, replacing a faulty porch light with a bright new bulb, setting a second on a timer. He taught Elsie how to check the latch and how to wedge a chair under the doorknob as a makeshift last line. He said none of it with preachy gravity. He said it as if he were showing her how to mend a fence so it would not fall when a storm came. Clara watched, and at one point the old armor she had learned around strangers fell away like a cloak. She came to the side of the barn where Luke was tucking the timer into a junction box and pressed her hand against his arm. The gesture was a thank you and a confession in one. He felt the smallness of it, how often gratitude and desperation lived side by side. When night folded down, darker and denser than any before, Luke sat on the porch with a mug of coffee gone cold at his side. He had an old rifle, kept mainly for wolves, the way a farmer keeps a scythe. He did not point it at shadows, and his fingers never caressed it with the rough affection of a man who loves the thing more than he loves the purpose. He sat with the weight of it there, not because he wanted to hurt, but because his presence might change the equation of a desperate man slipping against the world. The hours peeled slowly. He heard the night birds, the faint call of a coyote in the valley, the measured breathing from the guest house when Elsie stirred and settled again. Once there was a sound at the far fence. Luke turned and squinted into that stripe of darkness. A shadow, a man moving with the slow, unsure gait of someone who wanted to be invisible. Luke's jaw tightened. He rose, not in haste, but like a man who had considered his steps in his sleep. He moved quiet as a cat across the yard and stood at the edge of the light, watching the figure as it paused, and then walked on, disappearing toward the tree line. The scene might have been fiction in a different life, someone lured by memory back to the place they'd been taught to call home. Here it was a ruptured reality, a man who had choices, making the wrong ones, Mark. The name Clara had said once, the syllables like a small brass bell. Luke watched the shadow of a man whose life had been skinned down to thinness. He chose his steps to meet the man at the gravel road where the truck would be if it returned. This was not bravado, it was utility. It was the practical decision to be present, to make the next minute safer. They stood there in the wet light where the driveway met the road, two men breathing the cold air and assessing each other with the slow arithmetic of strangers. The intruder's face was a map of mistakes, eyes hollowed a little by too many nights of unslept regret. He raised his hands in a small, helpless old gesture. He began. The voice was rough, as if he had swallowed broken glass. "Don't start," Luke said. The words were not mean, but they were a barrier built of plain steel. "Clara has said enough for both of you. You don't get to come here and make it about you." The man's shoulders hunched. For a moment, Luke saw a memory of someone he might have been. Calloused hands from work, a soft mouth that once knew how to smile. "I'm sorry," he said, the apology flat and threadbare. "I didn't mean to scare." "You scared a child," Luke said. The accusation was not dramatic. It was a ledger entry. Mark, because Luke now knew the name, knew his wrongs like a litany. "I thought," he started, and the word collapsed into a sob that was too big for the small night. "I thought if I came back and said sorry, everything would. I don't know what I thought." "You thought you could fix it the easy way," Clara said, her voice coming from the doorway as she appeared then, shoulders bare under a thin sweater, eyes like flint. She had the face of someone who had been taught to be small and chose just then to be large. "You can't. You don't get to steal peace." Mark looked at her like a man newly unmasked. The plea in his gaze was naked and thin. "I wanted to see them. I wanted to tell Elsie I—" He could not say it. Words failed him where the work of making amends required more than language. "You can walk," Luke said quietly. It was not a triumph. It was an instruction. "You can walk away. If you come back, there will be more than words. If you stay away, maybe one day, when you are clean and steady, you can ask for forgiveness in a way that means something. Right now your visiting is breaking them up. You need to go." Mark sagged as if some small weight had been taken from his chest. He understood the edges of his own harm, and the realization was the kind of grief that bent a man toward humility. He turned and walked down the road, small in his frame, the night swallowing him like a bowl. Clara watched him go until he was gone, until the darkness swallowed the shape of him and the stars were all that remained. She slid down onto the porch step, shoulders shaking. She did not cry the way some women do, loud and ragged and world-bending. Her cry was the slow, deliberate unravel of someone who had kept so many things wound tight that there was hardly anything left to give. Luke sat beside her without asking why. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders with an ease he hadn't expected to have. There was no sermon, no grand pronouncement, just a warm, honest press of presence. Elsie came out then, barefoot and yawning, hair messy, eyes still haunted but steadier than they had been. She climbed into her mother's lap and curled, small as a cat. Luke watched the two of them, the quiet domesticity of it, grounding him in a way he hadn't anticipated. The man who had hurt them was gone for now, and the night breathed. Luke felt the old, tired vigilance loosen into something like relief. He did not imagine this was the end of it. People who fall into ruin often circle back, but for the moment, the immediate need had been addressed. He had kept his promise in the simplest, truest way, by being there. They sat until the stars thinned toward dawn, until the chill nudged them inside. Inside, the house smelled of coffee and damp wood and the thin comfort of a blanket. Clara checked on Elsie, smoothing hair, whispering soft reassurances she probably did not fully believe yet, but wanted Elsie to hear. Luke stood in the doorway and watched, feeling the quiet stitch of family being mended by small, steady hands. He had not come to be a hero. He had come to be a man who did what needed doing, whose life had taught him how to steady a place and make it safer for those who lived there. Tonight he had done that. In the hush after, when the house sighed and the world healed in small increments, he realized that the thing he had thought of as a personal choice to keep to himself was unraveling around the edges. That unraveling made space for others to fit. Outside, the first pale finger of morning crept over the fields. Inside, Clara slept a little, elbow hooked over Elsie, both of them breathing like they belonged to the same world again. Luke closed the door softly behind him and stepped out onto the porch for a long, slow minute. The air tightened around his face, clean and new. He did not feel heroic. He felt simply present, which was sometimes the most radical thing a man could be. When he went back inside, he carried with him a small, simple hope. One that was not a fix, but a promise. They would get through this in pieces. They would be made more careful, more watchful, and perhaps, in time, more whole. He set his mug in the sink, turned off the light, and for the first time in a long while, he fell into sleep that wasn't edged with the ache of unanswered things. The morning after Mark's disappearance carried a strange stillness, as if the air itself had been scrubbed clean. The horizon stretched wide and silver in the first light, the grass still beaded with last night's dew. Luke stood by the barn, leaning on the gate, and listened to the world wake up. The low murmur of the cows, the sleepy chatter of birds testing their voices against the dawn. It should have been a morning like any other, but the quiet carried something different, an emptiness where tension had lived. The ranch breathed again. Clara emerged from the guest house, wrapped in one of Luke's flannel shirts, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked rested for the first time in weeks, though the traces of exhaustion still lingered beneath her eyes. She paused at the porch steps, as if uncertain how to begin the day. When Luke turned toward her, she smiled, a small, real smile that didn't have to pretend anymore. "Coffee's ready," he said. She hesitated, then walked toward him, her bare feet brushing the grass. "I should be making that for you," she said. "You can tomorrow," he answered. "Today you just drink it." They drank in silence on the porch, mugs warm between their hands. The sky lightened to gold, and somewhere behind them, Elsie's laughter rang through the window as she talked to the old barn cat again. That sound, light, unburdened, was worth more than the sunrise. Luke glanced at Clara, saw the way she tilted her face toward the light, eyes closed, like someone remembering what it felt like to trust the day. He wanted to tell her she looked peaceful, but words like that felt too fragile, too easily broken. Instead, he said quietly, "You both can stay as long as you want. The world outside can wait." She opened her eyes and looked at him. "You've done too much already. We can't keep." "You can," he interrupted softly. "You both need a place that doesn't expect anything back. That's reason enough." Her throat worked like she wanted to argue, but instead she nodded. "Then maybe for a little while." The days after that slipped into a rhythm that felt like healing disguised as routine. Luke mended a broken fence post while Elsie ran through the tall grass with the horses, shadows chasing her. Clara cleaned the old kitchen, humming under her breath. The sound of her voice carried through the open windows like a promise the house had been waiting for. By evening, the sky bruised purple, and the air smelled faintly of rain again. Luke lit the lanterns along the porch and sat sharpening his tools. Clara came out with 2 plates, warm stew and bread she'd made herself. "You didn't have to cook," he said, smiling as she set the food beside him. "I wanted to," she replied, sitting down. "Feels strange not to repay kindness somehow." Luke took a bite, nodding approvingly. "Then call it even." They ate quietly. Every so often their eyes met, and neither looked away too quickly. The silence between them wasn't the emptiness of strangers anymore. It was the pause between 2 heartbeats learning the same rhythm. When they finished eating, Elsie came outside with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She crawled onto the porch beside Luke, resting her head against his arm. He froze, surprised by the sudden closeness, then relaxed. Her trust felt fragile, like a small bird perched on his shoulder. "Mama says you used to have someone," Elsie said softly. "Your wife." Luke nodded, staring out at the horizon. "I did. Do you miss her?" "Every day," he said. Then, after a moment, "But missing someone doesn't mean you can't keep living. It just means they mattered." Elsie thought about that, then whispered, "I think my dad mattered once, but not anymore." Clara's spoon clinked softly against her bowl. Luke didn't answer. He simply rested a hand over Elsie's, the gesture saying more than words could. The night pressed in around them, warm and full of small noises. The creak of the barn, the hum of crickets, the breath of a ranch that had started to feel alive again. When Elsie finally went inside to sleep, Clara lingered on the porch. Her face was half lit by the lantern glow, half shadowed by the night. "She's healing," Luke said quietly. Clara nodded. "Children are better at it than we are. They don't carry guilt like luggage." He studied her expression. "And you?" She let out a breath, her shoulders sagging. "I don't know how to stop feeling guilty. I let him back in, even when I knew he wasn't safe. I thought maybe I could fix him if I loved hard enough." "You can't fix what doesn't want to be fixed," Luke said gently. "You can only build something better beside it." She turned to look at him, eyes bright in the lamplight. "Is that what you did?" He shook his head. "No. I broke down first. Then I built again. But I built smaller, slower, one piece at a time." Her lips trembled with the faintest smile. "Maybe that's what I need to do too." He wanted to reach out, to tuck the strand of hair that had fallen across her cheek, but he didn't. The space between them was its own kind of fragile beauty. Instead, he said quietly, "Then start here. Start with peace. They sat together until the stars burned brighter, until the fields hummed with nightlife. Somewhere out there, the past was still moving. Mark's face fading into the distance, his mistakes dissolving into the dark. But on this porch, the present was enough. Over the next few weeks, time began to soften its edges. Luke found himself laughing more, mostly because Elsie demanded it. She dragged him into her world, painting old fence boards with bright colors, insisting he teach her to whistle, telling stories about a future that seemed suddenly possible. Clara watched them, her eyes often glistening with quiet gratitude. She had started wearing her hair down more often, had started to hum when she cooked, had started to walk like the weight she carried had become lighter. Luke noticed every small change. He pretended not to, but he did. One afternoon, while fixing a water trough, Luke heard Clara singing from the kitchen. The melody was soft, trembling at first, then stronger. It had been years since anyone had sung in that house. He stopped working, listening until the sound faded into the wind. He didn't realize he was smiling until the hammer slipped from his hand. That evening, as the sky turned the color of copper, Clara joined him at the stable. She leaned on the door, watching him work. "You're quiet tonight," she said. He wiped his hands on a cloth. "Just thinking." "About what?" "About how fast things change when you're not looking." She looked at him for a long moment. "Change isn't always bad." He nodded. "No. Sometimes it's what keeps us alive." She stepped closer. "You've given us more than shelter, Luke. You've given us a reason to breathe again." Her words hit deeper than she realized. He wanted to tell her she'd done the same for him, that her laughter had filled the corners of his silence, that her daughter's voice had made the ranch feel like home again. But instead he said, "Then we're even." She smiled, shaking her head. "No, not even close." The wind picked up then, tugging at her hair, carrying the scent of rain again. Luke reached up instinctively, brushing a strand from her face. His hand lingered just a second too long. She didn't pull away. The air between them changed, soft, heavy, electric. For a heartbeat, neither of them spoke. Then Elsie's voice called from the house, breaking the moment like glass. "Mama, come look! The sky's on fire!" They turned toward the horizon. The sunset bled crimson and gold across the clouds, the kind of color that felt too beautiful to belong to the real world. Clara laughed, relief and wonder mixing in her voice. "She's right," Luke said quietly. "It's on fire." Clara looked at him, her expression gentle. "It's just another ending," she murmured. "But it's beautiful." The days that followed blurred into one another. Luke found himself looking forward to every morning, to every small noise that meant they were still there. The loneliness he'd worn for years was still inside him, but it had changed its shape. It had turned into something he could hold without pain. Then, one afternoon, while Luke was stacking hay bales, a figure appeared at the far end of the road. For a moment, the old tension returned, sharp and cold. But it wasn't Mark. It was a deputy from town, hat tipped against the sun. He stopped at the fence and called out. "Morning, Harrison!" Got a message from Dalton. "Man turned himself in last night. Said his name was Mark Bennett. Thought you'd want to know." Luke nodded, a slow exhale slipping through his teeth. "Appreciate it." The deputy tipped his hat again and left. Luke stood there for a long time, staring out over the fields. It was done. Truly done. That evening, when he told Clara, she went still. Tears welled but didn't fall. He turned himself in? "Looks that way." She sat down, hands shaking. "I never thought he'd do the right thing. Maybe he finally wanted to stop running too." Clara wiped her eyes and smiled through the tremor. "Then maybe we all get to start over." Luke reached out, this time not hesitating, and took her hand. Her fingers fit against his like they'd been waiting to. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the world turned soft and golden again. Inside, Elsie played with the barn cat, her laughter spilling out through the open window. The sound wrapped around them like a promise that the worst was behind them. Luke squeezed Clara's hand. "Tomorrow," he said, "we'll go into town, get supplies, maybe a new paint for the house." She looked at him, eyes bright with something that felt like hope. And after that, he smiled, the corners of his eyes creasing. After that, we'll see what comes next." The porch light flickered as the night settled in. The stars came out one by one, like slow forgiveness written across the sky. Clara leaned her head on his shoulder, and Luke breathed deep, the smell of hay and rain and her hair mingling with the quiet pulse of the land. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man watching life pass by. He felt like someone standing in the middle of it, messy, uncertain, and completely alive. And when the wind moved across the fields, whispering through the grass, it sounded like the ranch itself was sighing in relief, finally at peace. The morning broke gentle and gold, the kind that seemed to stretch out forever over the hills. The air carried the smell of hay, dew, and promise. Luke woke before the sun fully rose, as he always did, but this time it wasn't out of habit. It was because he wanted to. He wanted to watch the light come alive on the horizon, to feel the quiet before the world stirred. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like a burden. It felt like peace. The house was still. From the window, he could see the faint flicker of movement from the guest house, Clara opening the curtains, her hair catching the early light. He stood there a moment, watching her silhouette. There was something about that sight that reached into him, something that whispered of belonging. By the time he stepped outside, the sun had fully climbed above the line of oaks. The fields shimmered in the light, the horses already moving slow through the pasture. Luke leaned against the railing of the porch, coffee mug in hand, and listened to the steady beat of the morning. The door creaked open behind him. "You're up early," Clara said softly. He turned and smiled. "Guess I didn't want to miss the sunrise." "You see it every day," she teased. "Not like this." She tilted her head, studying him. "What's different?" He looked out at the field again, the horizon painted with streaks of light. "You're here." Her breath caught, a small sound quickly disguised by the wind. "You're going to make me believe this place really needed us." "It did," he said, "and maybe I did too." They stood side by side for a while, not talking, just watching the day bloom. Inside, Elsie stirred awake, the sound of her laughter drifting through the window. The moment felt whole. Later that morning, they drove into town together. The road stretched long and dusty, cutting through fields that shimmered like gold in the sun. Elsie sat in the back seat, humming along to an old country song on the radio, her hair flying in the wind through the open window. Clara sat beside Luke, her hand resting loosely on her lap, her smile soft and unguarded. The town was small but lively. One main street lined with old brick buildings, a diner, a hardware store, and a general shop that sold everything from canned peaches to paintbrushes. People waved as Luke parked the truck, nodding in that easy, neighborly way country folks had. Clara looked around with quiet wonder. "It feels normal," she said. "It's been a long time since something felt that way." "Normal's underrated," Luke said, smiling. "Come on, let's get what we came for." They split the errands between them. Luke went to the hardware store to get paint, new window locks, and a box of nails. Clara and Elsie wandered through the general shop, picking out curtains, dish towels, and a small potted plant that Elsie insisted on buying for the kitchen window. When Luke found them again, Clara was laughing with the shop owner, her eyes bright and alive. She looked up and caught his gaze, and for a second, time slowed. There was something in her expression, something warm and certain, that made him feel like every lonely year had led him right to this moment. They loaded the supplies into the truck. As they pulled out of town, Elsie hugged the potted plant to her chest. "I'm going to name her Penny," she declared. "Like the horse." "Penny the plant," Luke said, amused. "Seems fitting." Clara shook her head, smiling. "You're both impossible." "Impossible's what makes life fun," he replied. Back at the ranch, they spent the afternoon painting the house. The old white boards had faded to gray over the years, but under the brush strokes of soft cream and pale blue, the place began to come alive again. Luke climbed the ladder, brush in hand, while Clara worked below, humming to herself. Elsie sat nearby, painting an old birdhouse with bright, uneven streaks of color. "You're missing a spot," Clara called up, pointing to the edge of the window frame. Luke squinted down at her. "You sure? Looks fine from up here." That's because you're tall enough to pretend it does, she said, laughing. He dipped the brush again and leaned over just enough to reach it, muttering, "Bossy." "I heard that," she said. "Wasn't hiding it." The sound of their laughter echoed across the yard. It blended with the rustle of leaves, the call of a distant bird, the soft clatter of Elsie's paint jar tipping over. For a moment, it felt like a life already built, a family not by blood but by choice. By sundown, the house glowed in the last of the light. They stood back, admiring the result. "It looks brand new," Clara said, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. Luke wiped his hands on a rag. "Feels new, too." Elsie bounced beside them, streaks of blue paint on her cheeks. "Can we make cookies now? We earned it." Clara laughed. "I guess we did." They baked together in the kitchen, the warm smell of sugar and butter filling the air. Luke leaned against the counter, watching Clara and Elsie move together like they'd been doing it forever, passing bowls, stealing bits of dough, laughing when flour dusted the floor. When the cookies came out of the oven, golden and soft, Clara handed one to Luke. "Careful, it's hot." He took a bite anyway and winced. "You weren't kidding," she laughed, the sound bubbling from her chest. "You never listen." "Only when it matters," he said, smiling through the heat. They ate on the porch as the stars began to appear. The air was cool and sweet. Elsie curled up on the swing, half asleep, her head resting against Clara's shoulder. The crickets sang their steady song, and somewhere far off, an owl called. Clara looked up at the night sky. "I used to think peace was a place," she said softly. "A town, a house, something you could find and stay in forever. But now I think it's a person. Or maybe people." Luke turned to her. "Maybe it's both," she smiled, eyes glistening in the starlight. "Maybe." They sat in silence, the kind that said everything words couldn't. Luke looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the woman she had become through pain and endurance, through love and loss. She wasn't fragile anymore. She was steady. She was light. "I was thinking," he said finally, his voice low, "about the south pasture. It's been empty since I lost the last hand who helped me. I could use someone who knows how to manage things, keep me from forgetting to eat on the long days." She tilted her head, amused. "Are you offering me a job?" "Something like that," he said. "Maybe more of a partnership." Her expression softened. "You sure about that, Luke Harrison?" He nodded. "I've been sure for a while." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached over and took his hand. Her fingers were warm, steady, real. "Then, I guess you're stuck with us," she said. He smiled, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "Wouldn't have it any other way." The stars spread wider across the sky, the kind of clear brilliance that only comes after rain. The porch light flickered, the horses moved softly in the pasture, and for the first time the ranch felt complete. Not because it was full of things, but because it was full of life. Weeks passed, and the rhythm of their new life settled in. Clara took charge of the garden, her hands deep in the soil each morning. Elsie fed the chickens, her laughter rising with the clatter of wings. Luke fixed the fences, mended the old tractor, and found himself smiling more than talking. Every evening, they ate together at the worn wooden table. The house smelled of food and sunlight and something new, something that had no name but felt like home. One night after dinner, Elsie handed Luke a small drawing she'd made. It was of the ranch, fields, horses, the three of them standing in front of the house. At the bottom, in her looping handwriting, she had written, "Home, the place where people stay." Luke stared at it for a long moment. His throat tightened. "This is perfect," he said. Clara looked over his shoulder, her hand resting on his back. "She's right," she whispered. He looked up at her then, his eyes soft. "So are you." Outside, the moon rose full and bright. The ranch glowed under its silver light. Luke walked out to the porch, Clara beside him, Elsie asleep inside. The air was cool and quiet, the kind of quiet that wasn't empty but full of unspoken gratitude. Clara leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. He wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "Do you ever think about what comes next?" she asked. "All the time," he said. "But for once, I'm not in a hurry to get there. She smiled against his shoulder. Me neither. The night deepened around them. Somewhere in the distance, the wind stirred the grass, whispering across the land like a lullaby. The stars shimmered, and the house behind them glowed faintly with the light of a life rebuilt. Luke looked out over the fields and felt a peace he hadn't known in decades. The pain, the loneliness, the ghosts, they were still there, but they didn't own him anymore. They were part of the soil, part of the story, part of the reason this moment mattered. Clara's hand found his, fingers lacing through his with quiet certainty. "We made it," she whispered. He nodded, his voice barely more than breath. "We did." And as the night wrapped around them, the ranch stood silent and alive, its fences steady, its lights warm, its heart beating again. For the first time, Luke Harrison knew he wasn't waiting for something to end. He was standing inside a beginning. Sometimes healing doesn't come with grand gestures or perfect timing. It comes quietly, in shared laughter, in a hand held under the stars, in choosing to stay when running feels easier. Luke, Clara, and Elsie learned that love isn't about erasing the past, but about building something stronger from its pieces. And on that ranch, under the endless western sky, they discovered that home isn't a place. It's the people who choose to love you anyway. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Love Chronicles, where every tale brings the warmth of redemption, the courage of love, and the beauty of second chances. Saddle up for more heart-stirring stories like this one, and let your heart ride with us through every sunset of the Wild West.